Hello, everyone. This is JT Keating, Vice President of Product Strategy here at Zimperium. We'd like to welcome you to another of our webinar series. This is the ongoing webinar series we're in the middle of the 7 deadly mobile security sins. As mobile security, as people are recognizing the need for mobile security and that mobile endpoints are in fact endpoints, then there's these various different sins that we've been running people through where it says if we don't secure mobile, what damage, what problems are we going to end up having? Today's is, as you can see, about exposing passwords and or login information. Standard perfunctory stuff. Please feel free to use the Q&A section to send any questions, and I will field any questions at the end. We try to keep these to about 20 minutes so that you guys can get packed information and then go off. We can make the slides available. The archive version of the webinar will be available within a day or so, and hopefully we'll go from there. And then the other thing is we don't use the chat capability. We've had some issues with it. So even if you have questions from a technical standpoint, please toss it in the Q&A section. So without further ado, let's keep rolling through the 7 deadly mobile security sins and specifically talk about how mobile can expose passwords or login credentials and how it can impact the business. And I think one of the main things as we start going through this from a theme standpoint is I think it's really important to remember one of the biggest differences in mobile is that the user is the admin. We've always been deathly afraid of carbon-based life forms, aka human beings, that as a security risk, they've always been the biggest security risk, and that has been even when they're sitting inside our corporate network the whole time. Now that they're the admin of these devices, these supercomputers that are in their pocket, they're the ones who decide a lot of things, and they're spending 80% of their time outside of the protected network. It doesn't matter if the corporation bought the phone or if it's a BYOD or tablet or whatever case may be. There's something about a mobile device that feels personal to us. So now you've got this user who's an admin who's making these decisions in terms of when am I going to update? Well, maybe I'm not going to update because it might slow my computer down or my tablet down, for instance. What networks am I going to connect to? What apps am I going to download? And then, oh, by the way, I probably have access to not only my corporate email, but my personal email on the exact same device. So this combination of personal and professional is really, yes, it has existed on traditional laptops and the like, but not to the same extent as it is on mobile. And a lot of times the decisions we're going to be making with the personal part of our brain exposes, and since this is the 7 deadly mobile security sins for enterprise CISOs, exposes the business side of things. So kind of keep that in mind as we roll through this. I like to start off and just kind of establish a punchline, right? And the punchline is this: 100% of our hundreds of enterprise customers, we have thousands of customers worldwide, but hundreds that are enterprise, truly legit enterprise, some of the biggest names in the world, 100% of those customers detect threats. And the thing that's important on that is not only is it the biggest names and the biggest, the targets from a nation state, yes, of course, they're detecting. But we're talking all the way down to small legal firms, small insurance companies, 100% are detecting threats. And I think it's really important to get our head around this concept. An endpoint is an endpoint is an endpoint. It doesn't matter at all if you've got PCI data sitting on a laptop or if you got it sitting on a smartphone. It makes no difference if you got patient data sitting on a desktop or if you've got it sitting on a tablet. An endpoint is an endpoint, and you need to protect them. And from a CISO standpoint, our traditional world, the traditional endpoints, represent about 40% of the endpoints in a typical enterprise today. That 40% where we've spent all our time, all our energy, all our focus, we have visibility into. Mobile devices equal 60% of the devices that are accessing corporate data, corporate email, everything else have no visibility into today as a typical rule. So it's really important as we get our brain around this to say, okay, hang on. The bad guys are very good at what they do. They're bad dudes. They're very good at what they do. And they're not dumb. One fundamental principle in security is time tested. The approach varies, but the law does not. And that law is the law of land and expand. The bad guys are way past, ever since viruses, when they were doing graffiti, when I first started security a billion years ago, that was all about ego. That was all about, I can prove I can do something nobody expects. That's not what these guys are about now. These guys are running a business. They're going to find the absolute weakest link and then make their way in. And they've always done that as soon as they pivoted towards stealing and things along those lines. So, a couple of years ago, it was point of sale terminals, and obviously the poor HVAC contractor for Target, and all those other examples, right? Today, it's this right-hand column. The user is the admin. The user always makes really bad decisions. There's no central patch management system. It spends 80% of the time outside of its network, and we have no protection on them. That's where they're going. And we've even seen things like the Lazarus Group announcing we're doing all Android malware, right? So that's the single biggest gap in endpoint security today, without question, is mobile. Poor Mr. Bezos has become the most recent person that has learned this the hard way. There's all sorts of discussions about the individual techniques and attacks, and we can get into that in terms of speculation. A lot of it's obviously not public knowledge. But the fundamental point is he just happens to be the latest person that said, you know what, it happened with mobile. And I think one of the most important parts of this whole thing is we're talking one of the most technically sophisticated companies in the world. Now, granted, some people would say, well, he was targeted for a reason. Well, there's a lot of different reasons to target. And as I said, 100% of our customers are detecting threats. But it also says this is a company that is very technically sophisticated. And so, should have been able to prevent this is the bottom line. So what makes mobile, I mentioned mobile was different. I said that the user is the admin. Another fundamental difference in mobile is that all of apps are in containers. They're in their own little buckets. So the traditional endpoint world that I've been in, we've all been in for quite some time, the whole reason it's called malware, the where part, is because it was software. And the malware would come on and it could go sideways, app to app to app to app. So in traditional endpoints, traditional operating systems, apps could play with other apps, and that's how they would spread, and that's how they would cause problems. And frankly, that's how they would be persistent, which is the second law of security that is still time tested. When the bad guys take the time to take over any computing device, they're going to try and remain persistent as long as possible. It sounds like I'm joking, but I'm not. It's an ROI calculation. They need to maximize their return for the investment they took to capitalize on that device. So in traditional endpoints, that was pretty straightforward. I could come in, I could go apps, and I could go sideways through apps. And when they started making that a little bit more difficult with machine learning detection of threats, then they started doing things like rootkits, or they started doing things like fileless attacks to continue to change the complexion. But again, on mobile, it's different. All apps are in containers. So the attacks are different. The objective is not. The objective is still to remain persistent on these unprotected endpoints. The only way to be persistent and to weaponize a device on mobile is to actually compromise the device or gain an elevation of privilege by something like, for instance, a malicious profile. So getting root access, doing a malicious profile, something to capitalize the device. Because if you're just an app, by itself, you're in your own little container. What you can do in our threat data proves it out. It's just fraud. So almost all malware on mobile is fraud of some sort. It can deliver an exploit to compromise the device, but it is untargeted and designed for fraud first and foremost. Zimperium was built from the very beginning to protect enterprises. Our job has always been to protect specific businesses against targeted attacks. So if somebody's going after XYZ Bank, how do we protect XYZ Bank? We did not start in the consumer space where fraud and malware and stuff could be an issue, right? So malicious apps are all about, they're untargeted, all about fraud. Phishing, I'm going to come back to it because obviously it's directly related to passwords and credentials. Also, though, untargeted, but more dangerous than malicious apps on mobile because the screen sizes are smaller, it's a lot easier to pull it off, everything on those lines. And the minute that the person hits, let's say, a browser to as a part of that phish, when the browser starts processing code, you can deliver an exploit, which again can compromise a device even faster and easier than a malicious app. Then there's network attacks. Here's one of the main things people need to know. And again, this is the 7 sins that CISOs need to know from a mobile security standpoint. One of the things that people absolutely need to know is, as I said, Zimperium is built from the very beginning to protect enterprises. So let's say right now we're trying to protect XYZ company, right? If I'm a hacker, I am not going to drop an app in the App Store and pray somebody from XYZ downloads it. That's not what I'm going to do. It's not efficient. And like I said, you're running businesses, it's ROI. What they're going to do is they're going to set up a fake Wi-Fi network or conduct some form of a man-in-the-middle attack at a coffee shop right across from XYZ headquarters. And by doing so, I can find somebody from XYZ quickly and then deliver an exploit based on what I've done in that surveillance during that fact that I own the network and compromise the device. So our data shows that 90% of targeted attacks begin with a network attack. And again, we're not trying to protect every single consumer on the planet. We actually have friends and partners that do that. Our first primary objective is protecting enterprises. So we care about targeted attacks. We knew from the very beginning what's something that Gartner and company have now caught on to, which is if the bad guy owns the network 90% of the time, you better do all of your security on device. And so we're going to come back to that in a minute, but I just want to plant that seed. Continue to remember the 90% approach on this. So this particular webinar is all about the risks and the implications of losing passwords and losing credentials and how that actually ends up occurring, right? We did a webinar series last year called the Top 5 Reasons That Hackers Want Your Device. And the very first one was to steal credentials and passwords. Obviously, if they're stealing credentials and passwords, in my mind, there's 2 buckets of credentials and passwords. One is, the ones from their personal side, which since we have a tendency to use the exact same passwords, no matter what people say at this point in time, if I can capitalize that, if I can compromise that, there's a good possibility I can use it in your corporate side. But then there's the other, which is what happens since this personal device is also a corporate device. If I've compromised it, which I'm about to show you in a demo, I see everything on both sides, personal and corporate. I get corporate passwords and user names directly right off of this phone if I've been able to compromise it. And then I can use that and create all sorts of additional problems. Because again, ultimately my objective is to land and expand. Part of the expansion is being able to use user IDs and passwords to further penetrate into systems within a company. And I mentioned phishing. 90% of phishing attacks 90% of breaches last year, according to Verizon and multiple other sources, started with a phishing attack. Well, 2/3 of emails are now read on mobile. And very importantly, we did a whole thing with Gigom just a little while ago on phishing, another webinar you can go check out if you want. As I mentioned on this theme, even if you've done a great job and you've protected your corporate email against phishing attacks, what about the personal email? And since if I go to a personal phish and an exploit is delivered, I now own that device. And if I own that device, I have visibility into both sides of this equation. So it's really a major thing when it comes to credentials and login information. Phishing attacks on mobile are very real, very prevalent, and very dangerous. Not only because of the personal corporate side, but, and this has been proven out repeatedly, it's even in the press again this last week, is that because of the form factor, things that might be really obvious on a big screen monitor, when you're down on a small screen, you can get away with a lot more in phishing, and it'll be even a lot less elegant and still be very successful because it's a different form factor. It's a lot harder for us to process with our eyes on a smaller screen, just as simple as that sounds. So in addition, obviously, part of the objective is not just getting your passwords and your logins is a means, not an end. What are you going to do it from an end standpoint? Obviously, one of the primary things is you're going to use it to steal data. Once I have your user ID, once I have your passwords, I can then go in and I can start stealing things directly from the various different sources that you have. This one just happens to be email, but the idea is still fundamentally the same. So I always think having a little bit of a visual helps with this. So I'm just going to run through a little bit of a demo that we do. If you were with us when we did the email, you'll notice the front end part of this whole thing. I mentioned 90% of the exploits, targeted attacks, begin with a network attack. On the left, you've got innocent victim's phone, of course. On the right, you've got the hacker's view of things. On the upper part is what's called a pineapple. That's a rogue access point. You'll see that this is literally like point and click type stuff. As we start this, it's kind of important to know that for as smart devices are, one of the things that makes them really stupid is the phone introduces itself to networks. And every network that the phone is ever connected to, it will just start going down through its list with whatever new Wi-Fi network it happens to meet. And it's up to the Wi-Fi network to decide to say yes or no. So the phone will go, hey, are you Starbucks? No, hey, are you Starbucks? Hey, are you Starbucks? Until somebody goes, well, yes, I am, right? Or more likely what it'll do is it'll say, hey, are you Starbucks? No, I'm not. Are you AT&T? No, I'm not. Are you Admiral's Club? Yes, I am, right? But the network just picks it. So all the bad guys have to do is just say yes when somebody does it. So in this particular case, the pineapple is not turned on yet. So the person is sitting there, they're going to go to their Wi-Fi. So the network doesn't show up yet because the pineapple hasn't been put on there yet. This is somebody that works for Acme Company. So now the hacker turns on the pineapple, and as long as it's broadcasting at a decent power level, if the phone on the left has connected to Acme network before, it just goes ahead and does so. And it's literally that quick. So now the bad guy owns the network at this point in time, which is going to be critical when we start talking about protection. He's also able to do surveillance. He's able to kind of see what's going on here. Now, the steps that are going on the left right now, we're actually doing a social engineering thing where we're showing the person, where they're going to be told you need to update something from Acme Company. The reality is none of this actually needs to occur. Once the bad guy owns the network, this is just for the demo, so you can actually see the steps as it's going. In this case, he's going to, okay, I'm installing my update. And as the update is installing, you'll notice over on the right-hand side that the hacker will, because of the exploit that is specific to this particular OS, he will very quickly, just by virtue of delivering this exploit, and I'm going to stop this thing here in a quick second, you can see right here that he has root access. So by delivering this exploit literally to this phone, he now has root access. I used to say, so he's got as much control over this device as the end user does. The reality is he has way more control over this device than the end user does, because by having root access, you get access to and control over things that Apple or Google will never give a user. And by the way, this is very different than being jailbroken. A lot of people will say, well, we got jailbreak detection, let's say, for instance, with an MDM, right? Jailbreaking is something a user does in order to be able to go install apps from someplace else. Jailbreaking increases the risk of the device. It doesn't necessarily mean it's being attacked or compromised. This is a straight up compromise. This is what the hackers do in order to have greater control over your phone. And of course, one of the things that they're absolutely going to want to do is show me the passwords, send me the passwords. So I'm going to stop it right here. And you can see, here's the case where it literally said, I'm going to go into keychain, which is supposed to be highly encrypted, supposed to be totally protected. And by the way, it is totally encrypted. But guess who holds the keys? The device. And since we own root on the device, we can open the keys. So now we've got all of these user IDs, all of these passwords. These ones happen to be Wi-Fi. We specifically, for the demo, left it Wi-Fi. Didn't have to be. It could have been email. It could have been Salesforce. It could have been any of those things where those passwords and credentials were in any way, shape, or form stored on that device. We now own them. So as you can see, it takes next to nothing, and all of a sudden I now have all the passwords, all the login credentials, etc. So I'm not going to go through the rest of the demo where we actually do other things, turning on the cameras. That was a different webinar we did. Sending emails and receiving emails and getting all the attachments. That was the first webinar we did. We've weaponized the device. We now can use it for pretty much everything, including delivering ransomware. There's an upcoming one. There's a little hint for you, as we continue to roll through this stuff. The key part is land and expand. And that's what we've now done, because now we have all of the user ID and passwords from both the personal side and the corporate side that this system has access to. And of course, if this device is an admin device, then we're even in greater stead as a hacker. So what do we do to actually protect on this? And the key part was actually explaining the threat, not to hammer you guys with a bunch of product, but it is useful to understand how you would actually protect it with Zimperium. Coming back to this, redundancy, 90% of the attacks start on the network, and the sole objective is to remain persistent, elevate privileges, and compromise the device, like we just got finished showing you. Well, as I mentioned, we knew from the very beginning that was the approach. So Zimperium, from the very beginning, has always said you need to do all of your detection on device. You cannot rely on going to a cloud-based detection service, because 9 times out of 10, the hacker owns the network. And if the hacker owns the network, the first thing he's going to do is cut off any access to a cloud-based detection service. So Zimperium has one core engine. This is our core strength. It is a machine learning-based engine called Z9. It is trained up in the lab against billions of data points. It actually does its detection on device based on what it's been trained. So we're not doing machine learning on device. That would actually take a lot of processing power. We process up and get the right, what we call classifier that says this, and this change in the system equals this device attack. It's that little equation that goes down. So the equation is very small, very fast, burns no battery at all. So we do 100% of our detection on device with Z9. Z9 can be rolled out in one of two ways. If you're trying to protect your device 100% of the time, like in the scenario that we were talking about predominantly here, right? We're saying, hey, we need to protect corporate passwords and corporate credentials. You would use a product we have called Zips. Think of it as EPP, Endpoint Protection Platform, for mobile. It's next generation machine learning detection that protects your device and all the data that's on that device 100% of the time against device network phishing and app attacks. If you have a mobile app, we have an SDK where you can drop in, it's called Z-App for in-app protection. You can drop the exact same Z9 engine into your app in a matter of minutes. In that case, you're not protecting the device 100% of the time. You're protecting the app and its session. So for instance, we have a very large financial institution that is using Zips to protect a couple 100,000 employees, and they're using Z-App to protect millions of mobile banking users. In the second case, they still are very much focused on how do we protect our accounts and how do we protect against compromises so that they can detect, in that case, for instance, if somebody was phished and we gave up their credentials directly, or about to do that, they can say, okay, this account is now flagged for fraud. Offline, we need to change their passwords. We know that they've been compromised. So it's still the same thing, but unlike the left, where it might be corporate user ID and credentials, on the Z-App side, it could be your mobile banking password, for instance, but it still needs to be protected on both sides. Both of those come into our Z console because that's our management console. Because we're doing 100% of our detection on device, we don't have to lock our console into one cloud. People that are doing cloud-based detection solutions, our brethren in this space, they've had to lock their console into one cloud. We don't care what cloud you want to put it on. If you want to do on-prem, that's fine with us. So part of being the enterprise leader and the guys that have been focused on enterprise in the beginning is we have to fit into your way of doing things as opposed to forcing you into ours. So whatever cloud you want to put it on, go for it. You want to be on-prem, go for it. If we look off to the right, we've got the broadest set of EMMs. We're also the only ones who can handle multiple EMMs in a single tenant, which is totally, as people are saying, hey, I'm going from one to another, or I've inherited a couple as a part of mergers. We can handle all of them in a single environment. Mobile Iron is one of our partners who's actually taken ZApp, our SDK, and dropped it directly into their EMM agent, which prevents having to install another app. It also gives 100% coverage immediately. It also enables you to do on-device detection and remediation right there on device. So it's pretty interesting play. Behind Z console, I mentioned there's risks and there's threats. Application risks. There are apps that are inside of your enterprise that can steal passwords and they can steal credentials that are not malicious. Since apps are put together as a bunch of Legos, a bunch of libraries and SDKs, it's possible a developer of a perfectly legitimate app, and we've seen this, is dropping, put in a new library to get time to market that is decrypting traffic or sending it to a foreign country, any of these things. So like, for instance, a quarter of the iOS apps send traffic off in plain text. That can include user IDs and passwords. So again, is another way to expose yourself to that. Z3A is advanced app analysis, where malicious apps are detected by Z9. Z3A will identify all of the apps and all of the risks associated with those apps that are in your environment. And then we take all the forensics data and everything, including, for instance, has this person been compromised, therefore their user ID and password is at risk, and we put it into the broadest set of SIM solutions. McAfee down there also has a Envision mobile product, which is Zimperium at its core for McAfee customers. So that helps that. And then Splunk, we do a lot of stuff with Splunk, including having something in the Splunk app. So that is the key point. The problem is the user is both personal and professional on these devices. They are the admin. And as a result, it is one of the easiest possible ways, whether it's through phishing, whether it's through a network attack, whether it's a compromise, to lose user IDs and credentials that can then be subsequently used either from this device or from other devices to further penetrate into your network. So I hope you've got some value out of this webinar. Of course, I've enjoyed doing it. I will stop for a second to see if anybody has any questions, and if not, then we will wrap it up. So I don't see any questions. So with that, I would like to thank everybody. And again, this archive version will be up on the site within a day or so. And thank you very much for giving us your time. And we will talk with you all soon.